Thank you very much, Lawrence, and everyone for coming. I'm glad that so many people are interested in the Security Council, because I think it's very important and it's rather underreported in Australia. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous people whose land this once was, and strongly recommend the book 1835 about the history of Melbourne. It taught me more about Melbourne than I'd ever learnt before, and it's not a history of which we can be proud in every way. The Security Council is like no other body in history, says one of the authorities writing about it. And that's a pretty big claim, and I think it's true, and I'll try and show why. But it's important to look at whether the Security Council really does have the authority to take on the tasks that it's set to do. And the Permanent Five, who are often criticised for being unrepresentative of the world, and in a very direct sense they aren't adequately representative, but they do represent 28% of world population, 44% of global economic output, which is a pretty large proportion, and they are of course completely militarily dominant. And it is also true that under the Charter there are in effect no limits on what they can do if they agree. And of course they don't always agree, but they do agree over 90% of the time, which is far more than most people would imagine from the news reports that we get. And then of course the elected 10, the E10, add to that authority because of the fact that they are elected by the 193 members of the United Nations. Most of you will be familiar with the next half dozen slides, so I'll go through them very quickly. This is the aim of the UN. Centrally, the UN is about peaceful conflict resolution, attempting peaceful conflict resolution. It was set up after the war to avoid the scourge of war, and the main part of the Charter is all about how that could be done, and the subsidiary ends there are all ones that would contribute to peaceful conflict resolution as well. The Charter sets the functions for the Security Council, primary responsibility for international peace and security, and it does have the central responsibility in the global community for global peace and responsibility and security. And secondly, in Article 25 there, the members of the UN agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the Charter. Now that's a big commitment, and not every member does that. Probably very few do it in relation to every decision, and of course very few of the P5 do it in relation to every one of their own decisions. The central purpose of the Security Council is peaceful settlement of disputes. That's set out in general terms for the whole organisation in Article 2, but specifically in relation to the Security Council in Chapter 6, which sets out peaceful mechanisms of dispute settlement, things like negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement or regional arrangements. Now, many of you will be familiar with that, but I want to emphasise the importance of it because I think it's not adequately recognised by most member states, and Australia is one of those. In the two most recent defence white papers, the UN is mentioned in a sentence or two, but there is nothing about peaceful conflict resolution. It doesn't mention the fact that diplomacy is our first form of protection. In other words, it's not in the context of dispute resolution. It's only in the context of military activity, which is one part of the way disputes get handled. the UN also has the capacity, if the Security Council judges that it needs to take coercive measures, and particularly sanctions, and there are many sanctions regimes at present, to put pressure on governments to implement the decisions that the Security Council has made. They're often economic sanctions, but there's sometimes diplomatic ones, sometimes various forms of political pressure, but they're more coercive. And if coercive, non-violent, non-use of force measures are not working, the UN does have the capacity to use force, and there are 2 articles which give it that capacity under the Charter. One, when the Security Council agrees that force should be used, and there have been very few instances of that. Korea was one, the first Iraq War was another, and Libya was a third. But it can happen, Article 51 gives countries, not gives them, but reiterates what they clearly have, which is the right of self-defense, the right to use force to protect themselves if they are attacked. Now the next slide is one that you may be less familiar with, and it's a very important one. The central point is that after the end of the Cold War, the Security Council really started to come into the role that the drafters of the Charter had set for it, and it's become a very much more active forum. It now meets virtually every working day of the year, and sometimes at the weekends when it's under pressure. And the figures there for July 2012 to June 13 are the most recent complete ones that are available. 51 resolutions were passed, 22 presidential statements, which are just as difficult to negotiate as our resolutions. They don't carry quite the same authority. Media statements, 26 media statements, which are the subject of vigorous wrestling over precise wording. There are as well 15 peacekeeping missions with a total of 115,000 personnel, and they cost close to $8 billion a year at present. So they're a major, the largest part of the UN's expenditure by far. 13 political missions, 19 subsidiary bodies working overseeing sanctions, and 12 committees looking at thematic issues like protection of civilians during armed conflict, and which, by the way, has become one of Australia's central concerns while it's on the Security Council. I'll come back to that. The question often asked is why did Australia win? And the reason was, of course, that we deserved to win. But apart from that, we tried very hard, and it was an amazingly good result. Very few people expected it. One thing against us getting a result as good as 140 votes was that we started the campaign late. Finland and Luxembourg had nominated at the beginning of the 2000s. Australia didn't nominate till 2008, and already 30 countries had pledged before Australia had nominated. So we had to get our 129 votes out of just over 160, and we did that principally, I think, by presenting what Australia's record was in relation to development and peacekeeping. We were at that time in the process of increasing our aid. We've always been moderately active in peacekeeping, sometimes, particularly in countries close to us, very active indeed, like in Timor-Leste, in Bougainville and in the Solomons. And the other tactic that was very effective was bringing ambassadors from New York to visit Australia, and over 100 came. I presume all were invited, but over 100 came, and they were given 2 weeks or so in Australia, in several cities and so on, seeing what a multicultural country Australia is, how strong it's growing economically, how culturally, what cultural vitality it has, and so on. And many of them went back very impressed by what they saw. I think that was a very significant factor. And another one was, in the case of Africa, that quite a lot of Australian companies have been active in investing in Africa, and many of those African countries which had over 50 votes were impressed by that. So, and no bloc worked against Australia. Russia didn't oppose Australia because it has strong links with the United States and the United Kingdom. So there wasn't an undercover sort of opposition to us. I think it also helped a bit that we were on the other side of the world from Finland and Luxembourg, and some people would see greater diversity in having Australia and one European country rather than two Europeans and not Australia. The principal thing to be said about being an elected member is that there are quite a lot of constraints on what elected members can do. And the first is obviously the dominance of the US. It seeks to dominate everything it judges to be important in which it engages. And Britain and France are very active as well. And those three countries work together a lot of the time, and quite powerfully. The P5 meet informally, frequently, and so they quite often speak with a single voice, though they clearly don't always. So the P5 do set the tone and the agenda to a significant extent, and that means that it's quite difficult for a single elected member to come in and exert influence. And the question is, can they really? But it's clear also that the Permanent Five don't always get their own way. The US clearly doesn't always get its own way. It couldn't get a resolution up on invading Iraq, for example, because most of the world was opposed to that. There's been deadlock over Syria. Neither the US or Russia have been able to get their way on that. And there was substantial opposition within the Security Council, as around the whole UN and in most countries, about a military strike against Syria when the US was seriously contemplating that. So, and it took some persuading to bring them in response to the breakdown of order in Libya in 2011, though they were persuaded in the end. Experience does show that elected members can have substantial influence. I haven't got time to go through other countries' experience, but I'll just use one example here. Turkey and Finland urging greater use of mediation, and attention to mediation has been going up in the last few years. The Security Council has done a paper on it. The capacity to offer mediators has been, by the Secretariat, has been growing, and so that mechanism of peaceful conflict resolution has been becoming more substantially used. And of course that means that quite a number of disputes are resolved before they get to the stage of being publicly acknowledged as major threats to law and order, to peace. Every country, of course, gets to chair the Security Council at least once, and if you're at the right alphabetical point, then you may get it twice. And Australia had it once in September and is getting another chance in November next year. So what has Australia been doing? Well, every member has a standard set of activities for a start. They have to attend the formal meetings, which are quite formal, where there's very little, there's negligible spontaneous negotiation. They hear reports. I'll come to that in a minute. There are closed consultations, which are again are pretty official and unspontaneous. They have to attend the subsidiary body meetings. Holding the pen means that a country has the responsibility for drafting the resolutions in relation to that particular country. Australia holds the pen in relation to Afghanistan. So Australia has to draft the resolutions relating to Afghanistan. We took that over from Germany. Germany was an elected member for 2 years before Australia. And then there are lots of informal, normally bilateral discussions, and that's where a lot of the negotiation takes place. Much of the work of the Security Council is taken up with Africa because of the number of civil wars that there have been recently in Africa. In terms of procedures, very briefly, the meetings are pretty formal. I've said enough on that, I think. The major issues during the first 9 months of last year, just some three that were significant because the first two were advances. The third was an example of inaction, and the fourth of a growing orientation. In relation to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, in March last year, what was called an intervention brigade was formed with an expanded mandate so that it could initiate military action. It was a very big issue of controversy, as you can imagine. I mean, the record of peacekeeping is about keeping armed forces apart. For a peacekeeping mission to have an enhanced mandate, giving it the responsibility for deciding when it should use military action, was a major, some would say, step forward. Others were not so sure, but it was agreed unanimously, and it was judged to be appropriate because the rebels in the east of the Congo were so anarchic and out of control. It was felt to be necessary for the peacekeeping force to be able to act with more vitality and vigor than peacekeeping forces have often been mandated to do in the past. In relation to Mali, a month later, in April last year, the multi-dimensional integrated stabilization mission also had an enhanced mandate, able to take military action if that was judged to be appropriate in the north of the country. I regret to say that in relation to the Central African Republic, lots of people were reporting, particularly in the second half of last year, that there was a growing breakdown of law and order. There was some people started towards the end of the year to call the situation pre-genocidal, and yet the Security Council endorsed action by the African Union and then action by France, but was reluctant to agree on a peacekeeping mission, a peace establishing mission it would have to have been, because the African Union didn't want it. They wanted to have the responsibility, and the P5 didn't want the financial cost of another major peacemaking effort. And it's only now, as I'll come to in a minute, that a more concerted action is under discussion. There has been a growing attention throughout this last 15 months to concentration on protection of civilians. I went over there in September last year to watch Australia chairing the Security Council, and it just happened to be a particularly effective month, a particularly interesting month. There were the normal bread and butter issues, that the overseeing of sanctions, the overseeing of places where there were missions, which go on every month, and that's what's listed on this slide. Australia reported on sanctions against Iran, but the interesting things in September were the significant initiatives that happened in relation to Syria's chemical weapons, in relation to humanitarian activity in Syria, and the opening of the dialogue between Iran and the US, and Australia's leadership in the small arms and light weapons area. And I'll talk very briefly about each of those. I'll have to scoot along. These slides will have to be handled very, very quickly. I presume many of you will recall what happened in relation to Syria. There was a confirmed use of chemical weapons in August, which involved the death of about 1,500 people. Obama had said if chemical weapons were used in Syria, this would be a red line which would generate other action. He argued that this justified a military strike against Syria, and yet there was substantial opposition and reluctance to have a military strike, not only in much of the United States, but in many other countries as well. Some of you will remember that there was opposition in the House of Commons. That's in the next slide. But it was quite clear that there was majority opposition in much of the world to the proposed military strikes. So he suggested referring the issue to Congress, which, by the way, under the American Constitution is required to do, but American presidents haven't been notable for their implementation of that constitutional requirement, and so he was doing no more than fulfilling his constitutional obligation. And when the discussion began in Congress, it seemed quite possible that Congress might not have agreed. The Security Council was not in agreement. There was deadlock about whether a military strike would be justified, and of course Russia would have vetoed that if a resolution had gone up on it. Then what happened was that Kerry was asked by a journalist in London, is there anything that Syria can do to stop a military strike? He said, well, if they gave up their chemical weapons, by the end of the week we wouldn't attack them. And Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, immediately seized the initiative and said, well, let's see if we can get Syria to give up their weapons. There were immediate negotiations in Geneva between Kerry and Lavrov and the Syrian foreign minister. There was agreement by the end of the week, and 2 weeks later there was a resolution through the Security Council which not only agreed that Syria would be required to give up the weapons and sign sign the Chemical Weapons Convention, but that as well, and this is the slide I'm having to dash through because we won't get through otherwise, in a way the most important part of the resolution was that, it's the next slide still, the most important part of the resolution was that it called for the establishment of a transitional government with full executive powers. This was part of a resolution that went through unanimously. That wasn't as actively reported as it deserved to be, because it meant that Russia had accepted that provision, and that's of course what's being attempted to be negotiated in the Geneva II talks. Now, I was at the Security Council when that resolution went through, and it was a packed occasion. It was a very significant event, because it was the first occasion when there'd been a unanimous agreement about a resolution on anything to do with Syria in the previous 2.5 years, and given the deadlock, it was therefore a very significant step forward. That significant step forward over only one aspect of the conflict did then pave the way for the possibility of a step forward on humanitarian issues. I'm sure all of you will be familiar with the horrors of what's going on in Syria. I won't rehearse them. But amongst those horrors are that the Syrian regime has been preventing the UN and other humanitarian organisations from enabling their people to come into Syria to do their work, preventing pharmaceuticals from coming in, have been even bombing hospitals, have been stopping convoys. It's a shocking situation, and Australia has been leading the work within the Security Council in conjunction with Luxembourg and more recently with Jordan. First, in trying to get a resolution, that wasn't successful, but then immediately after the resolution on chemical weapons had gone through, they tried to get a presidential statement up, and that was agreed. And that presidential statement has quite a number of provisions in it relating to health issues, treatment of the injured, food supplies, etc., etc., etc. It was a significant step forward. A third issue that happened in September was the beginning of dialogue again between the US and Iran. That didn't happen at the UN. It happened partly because Rouhani, the Iranian president, was in New York for the General Assembly opening, and Obama and Rouhani talked on the phone and agreed to begin negotiations, which have since, of course, made progress. I won't go over that in any detail. I'll answer questions later if you'd like to ask them. But I do want to talk about what's happened since September in a minute, and also about Australia's initiative while it was chairing the Security Council in September. Every chair has the chance to choose an issue which they regard as of real importance. Australia had thought for a while that maybe the issue of women and children in armed conflict might be it, but several other countries had taken that issue up. It's a very important one, centrally important one, but they thought it would be better to take up an issue that had been neglected in recent years. So they took up the issue of small arms and light weapons, and they put out a discussion paper about it, and then had 2 weeks of negotiations, and finally got a resolution passed with only Russia abstaining. Russia didn't oppose it. Russia abstained because it didn't say anything about the supply of weapons to the rebels in Syria, but the resolution did get through, and that was the first time that a resolution on small arms and light weapons had ever been passed by the Security Council. It covered things like the illicit transfer of weapons, destabilising accumulation, the misuse of small arms and light weapons, and practical steps to strengthen the Council's response to that problem. So now, before the last stage of this talk, a little about what's happened since September. To make sure I was up to date, I rang Gary Quinlan yesterday. Gary Quinlan's the ambassador in New York, and we had a long talk, and he was very helpful briefing on what had been happening more recently. There are two sources. There's a central source, by the way, if any of you want to follow what's happening on the Security Council. There's a wonderful organisation called Security Council Report. If you Google Security Council Report, you'll find it. It was established with funds from Canada and Norway by Colin Keating. Colin Keating was the New Zealand ambassador on the Security Council during the horrors of the failure of the Security Council to take the Rwanda genocide seriously. And he was very concerned about what could be done to increase the effectiveness of the Security Council. And one way that he thought it could happen was by greatly increasing the supply of absolutely accurate information about what's happening in the Council. And that's what the Security Council report provides. On every issue that comes to the Security Council, it reports accurately on what's coming and then what's happened. They do a monthly report which gives a clear indication of what is coming and what happened in the previous month, and so on. Anyway, I strongly recommend that source to you. Now, Gary said that March 2014 had been the busiest month for many years. They had 10 meetings on Ukraine, several on Syria, others on the Central African Republic and South Sudan, as well as the normal flow of supervisory meetings. They'd got through, they'd attempted, the US had attempted to have a resolution on the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but of course Russia vetoed that resolution. Even though the Charter has a provision in it, in Article 27, that requires obligatory abstention by disputants to conflicts. This hasn't been used for decades, but it's actually in the Charter, and other members of the Security Council could have drawn attention to it if they'd wanted to prevent Russia from vetoing. But that would have been, of course, a very provocative thing to have done. They decided not to do it. All the members decided not to do it. I don't think they even adequately addressed the possibility, but they could have done it, and that the power to do it was there, and it didn't happen. In relation to the major issues, in relation to Syria, the presidential statement had relatively little impact. So Australia and the situation has worsened since September. So Australia began negotiations again at the beginning of this year on a stronger resolution with the assistance of Luxembourg and Jordan. And there was very vigorous negotiation about this, inclusive negotiation. One feature of it was that Australia didn't just negotiate with the Permanent Five, it included the other elected 9 in those negotiations. That had the effect of building up support, and despite the unease of the P5, that others were being included as fully as they were, it didn't stop the resolution getting through, and a unanimous resolution was finally passed, which argues very strongly for access for humanitarian agencies in Syria. It also says that if non-compliance continues, then consideration will be given to stronger sanctions. Other recent developments include that Australia continues to pursue the small arms and light weapons issue in a number of ways. It's the pen holder on Afghanistan, as I mentioned, and 2 new mandates have to be written and negotiated in relation to the UN mission in Afghanistan and the multilateral international security assistance force. And there is, I'm very glad to say, at this moment, under vigorous negotiation, a preparation of a resolution on the Central African Republic. So, to conclude, there are a number of things that can be said, I think, that are relatively positive. Although the elected 10 are constrained by the shortness of their term and the fact that the P5 have so much power relative to the others, that nevertheless an elected member can be influential if determined and well prepared and networks carefully. One of the advantages that the elected 10 have is that they're not locked into set positions in the way that the P5 are. The P5 are meeting every day virtually, every year. And so they know each other very well. It's hard for them to move. Whereas a new group coming in every year are not locked in quite the same way. They have more flexibility, in other words. And if they use that flexibility, they can help the P5 evolve in their attitudes. And that really is what happened over the humanitarian resolution in relation to Syria. One of the nice things to hear in September, while Julie Bishop was chairing the council at the end of the final week of the month, the United States Permanent Representative Samantha Power said, and I quote, "Gary Quinlan has done a magnificent job of chairing the council." Well, I think it's pretty uncommon for something like that to be said, but she said it, and I heard her say it, and it was impressive that she did. The Russians didn't say that publicly, but it was reported to me that they had said privately that Australia had been effective because it had been pragmatic. Some of the developing countries said in public, I heard Argentina and Guatemala say that Australia spoke positively and professionally and had done their role, fulfilled their role very effectively. Someone from a sceptical NGO, not someone who received any Australian money, said that everyone now takes Australia seriously. It has pushed hard on many fronts and been collaborative, helpful, straight, competent, clear and generous. The thing that really impressed me by the style of the Australian delegation was not only their professionalism, which was clear, which was readily apparent, and their hard work, which was also readily apparent, but their unpretentiousness. They were not condescending or superior or in any way claiming for themselves positions that weren't justified, but which many diplomats in the past have tended to do, not just Australian ones, but from many countries. I thought that the mission in New York now are behaving like genuine Australians, in a unpretentious, hard-working, but serious way, but with humour and humanity. I thought we could be proud of them, honestly. And their effectiveness in relation to several things that I've mentioned is clear. It was disappointing, I have to say, that the Abbott government only decided to give $12 million to humanitarian relief in Syria after all the work that had been done. We should have been giving many tens of millions of dollars, it seemed to me, and that was something of an embarrassment. Anyway, Australia has a second month to chair the Council in November, and that will be another opportunity. And just one final slide, because Peter said that I'd say something about Security Council reform. Just one remark about Security Council reform, and that is that I think the fact that Australia is in the sequence of elected members who have had some influence in quite effective ways. Germany in the 2 previous years had likewise had some impact. Norway some years before, and so on. Numbers of countries have. That gives some encouragement to the idea that one way of reforming the Security Council, which should be taken seriously, is to slightly enlarge the Council from, say, 15 to 21 or something like that, but enlarge it entirely with additional elected members. The advantage of elected members is that they're accountable to the countries who vote for them. It makes them therefore that much more attentive to opinion in the whole membership of the UN, and I think that that's a very significant advantage. It also means that they'll try very hard to be effective members. To make that provision effective, the Charter provision that requires elected members not to run again for a second term immediately would have to be deleted. And if it was, then that would mean that a country like India could be repeatedly elected. That isn't what India wants. What India wants is to be one of the permanent 5, as do a number of other countries. But if this would be a second best from their point of view, but it could be a workable second best. And the other thing that could be done is to set a geographic structure for the elected membership to ensure that there is fair representation from each of the major regions of the world. Well, I hope that gives you enough of a stimulus to think of many questions. Thanks very much, Lars.